Hello, everyone, and welcome to SCORE Fairfield County's live webinar on what to consider when selling a small business. I'm Bob Hogan, the webinar coordinator today and a business mentor here at SCORE Fairfield County. I'm going to be your host, and our presenter is Cliff Ennico. More on Cliff in just a minute, but first some brief information on SCORE. SCORE is a nonprofit national partner of the SBA, and locally here at SCORE Fairfield County, we have over 130 volunteers with a wide range of industry, process, and subject matter expertise. We offer three primary value-added services to small business owners. First of all, we offer free one-on-one counseling, and you can do that by video, telephone, email, and you can access that by using the yellow link that you see on the screen, or you can go to our website and hit the request a mentor button on our website. Secondly, we offer a wide range of educational workshops and webinars, about 150 throughout the year. And lastly, we offer extensive resources on our website, including access to subject matter experts. Our next live webinar is going to be tomorrow, Wednesday, March the 3rd at noon, and the topic is digital marketing in 2021 with Jeff Seaver and John Dupre presenting. And again, you can find more specifics on our website, fairfieldcounty.score.org. And if you're on our website, you'll also be able to access a large number of archived webinars that can be looked at on demand and on a wide range of topics. Just some logistics today. We have set aside time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. As noted in the chat box, you can put in a question at any time. Just hover on the bottom of your screen and click on chat. Cliff will make sure to make time to answer those at the end of his prepared remarks. We will end sharply though at 1 o'clock to respect your time. The session is being recorded and you can access the recording within about 48 hours on our website, fairfieldcounty.score.org. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Cliff Ennico. Cliff is a nationally recognized small business legal and tax expert and is best known as the former host of Money Hunt on PBS, where entrepreneurs defended their business plans before America's toughest panel of experts. An attorney and small business consultant here and based in Fairfield, Connecticut, he has helped launch over 15,000 businesses. He's the author of 16 books, most recently the Crowdfunding Handbook, How to Raise Capital for Your Business Using Equity Funding Portals. Cliff, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's so funny, I've been doing this now for a very long time. This year, I'm going to be celebrating my 40th anniversary doing programs for SCORE, believe it or not. I was a child prodigy. There were no child labor laws back then. My first SCORE presentation was at the age of 2. No, I'm only kidding about that. But I have been around a very long time. And frankly, it's sort of fun because I've been around long enough that a lot of the clients that I helped form many years ago, I'm now helping to sell. And help them realize their exit strategy. So this program is kind of a heartfelt one for me right now. Although I always hate to sell a client, I always hate to see a client move on to the next level because it means that they've outgrown. It's like having children in a little bit of way. The best ones always outgrow you. Okay, if you didn't believe that I was a lawyer, now you believe it. Now these are the usual disclaimers. The most important one is the one on the top, which says basically that while we are going to get into some legal and tax stuff in this program, there's a very big difference between giving out legal information and giving out legal advice. There's a difference between saying, well, this is kind of what the law is all about, which is what I'm going to be doing today. And now this is what you should do, Bob and Elliot. This is why you should do something different. That's advice. And really, I'm not able to do that in a program like this. If you really, want that kind of one-on-one advice, you're going to have to hire me and pay a few bucks, a very reasonable fee, of course, for my services. So if you hear anything on this program that sounds like a good idea and you do it, and you end up totally blowing the sale, you end up selling your business for a fire sale price, your spouse divorces you, you lose your house, the kids, don't want to talk to you anymore, the dog pees in your leg, and you end up living in a diaper box under the Brooklyn Bridge. It's nobody's fault and you can't sue anybody. That's basically what that says. All right, so you have a business and you're probably wondering after all these years of knocking yourself out, whether it's worth anything. Should I be looking to sell my business at this point in my life, in my career? Most of us at some point don't want to be working into our 90s. We're thinking about retirement, and especially after the last year with COVID, it's becoming a very something that's I think on a lot of people's minds right now, especially us older folks. Is it really time to sell? There are right reasons and wrong reasons for wanting to sell. There's no right answer. I mean, there's no perfect answer here. It really depends on you. You have to do a little bit of soul searching here. Here are some of the right reasons to retire. You're ready to retire, and your kids don't want the business. You're ready to move on to the next life. The shuffleboard and pickleball world of Central Florida. You're ready for that now, and and there's nobody in your family that really wants the business. There's no one that you can pass it on to. That's the situation. They're all doctors, lawyers, whatever. They're doing programs like this. They don't want to run a deli. So that's a good reason to retire. Your revenue profits are at an all-time high or have been relatively steady over time. Some of you remember the TV series Seinfeld that ran on television during the 1990s. When that show went off the air in 2000, Jerry Seinfeld was actually criticized by some people in the media because it was at an all-time high. His ratings, whatever, he had the #1 show on television when he decided to shut it down and go off the air. And his response to that, as I remember reading in magazines and newspapers, that was his idea. He wanted to go out on a high. He wanted to go out with the #1 show in television. He didn't want to, stay on board and let it decline to the point where the ratings weren't accessible and the network would shut him down. He wanted to go out on a high so that people would always remember what this show was all about. You may want to take the Seinfeld strategy yourself with your business. The market for your business is hot. Okay. I mean, right now, I hate to say this, but I'm in Fairfield County, Connecticut. I am getting, people, pulling up to my house at least once a week with New York license plates, knocking on my door and asking me if my house is for sale. Now, my house is not for sale. I'm not looking to move anytime soon. But, I gotta say, the fact that these people are knocking on my door once a week, usually on the weekend, is starting to get me think, maybe I ought to take a look at Zillow. Maybe what is my house worth here? Maybe it's time to at least start thinking about making that transition. Of course, the SCORE people now are all having a heart attack because when I said that, no, we're going to wonder who the hell's going to be doing all our programs. So just to let you know, don't worry, guys. Nothing's going to change soon. And thanks to the wonderful world of Zoom meetings, even if I am in Timbuktu, I can still do these. So no worries. But there are some wrong reasons too for wanting to sell too. A lot of people are looking to sell businesses right now because their businesses have been hit hard by COVID-19. I think that's a mistake. Those of you who've heard my previous programs on COVID know I'm encouraging you to try to fight it out, tough it out, and stick around. Because if you sell now, especially when your business is in a trough, you're probably going to be selling at a fire sale price. People are going to take advantage of that. And you may end up selling a very viable business at an all-time low price. I think that's a bad idea. Your revenue profits have been declining steadily over time. You have a dog with fleas. That is not the right time to sell. Again, you're going to end up getting a fire sale price. The buyers will circle you like sharks smelling blood in the water. You need to sell to pay the business's debts. If you are heavily leveraged, if you owe a lot of money, you are not going to get a lot for a business. You're not. You're going to get a few dollars over the debt. If you're lucky, you'll find a buyer who'll be willing to assume the debt, and maybe he or she will be gracious and let you have a royalty on sales for a couple of years as an earn-in. That we'll talk about that later. That's not the right time to sell the business either, because you're going to have to cover the debts. Try to pay down some of that debt and make your balance sheet a lot more attractive before you sell. A big competitor is moving down the street. Even though you're not required legally to tell people about this when you're looking to sell a business, if you are in a business that's becoming obsolete, technology is making your business obsolete, or there's a big box retailer, or you're a little pizza parlor and a big Sbarro's is moving down the street, this is not the time to sell the business. If you sell the business now, you're likely to get hit with a fraud suit at some point when the buyer comes in and realizes that you just handed off the business just before the truck hit them. That's not going to be a good thing, and it could lead to some legal issues. Last but not least, You are personally burned out and will sell to anyone with a pulse. Emotions are very, whenever you are acting out of emotion, you almost always make bad business decisions. This is one of Cliff Ennico's rules of life. I never ever make difficult decisions when I'm in an emotional state, when my mind is governed by either fear or anger or something like that, or just sheer exhaustion. That's when you make bad decisions, and that's when you cut yourself a deal that's not a good deal for you and you can't get out of. Wait until you're a little calmer and that you're looking at things rationally. That's the time to do the number crunching necessary to sell a business. So here are some of the questions that you need to ask yourself when you're thinking about, is it time to sell? Are you ready to move on with your life? When you sell a business, you're probably going to sign a 2 to 5 year non-compete. That's going to be pretty tough. You're not going to be able to do the same thing, anywhere near where you once were, for a fairly long period of time. And you have to honor that. If you don't, you get sued. Do you have enough money to live on without having to rely on the sale of the business proceeds? If you're running a small retail or service business, it's not very likely that you're going to get more than like $250,000 or $300,000 for that business, unless it's really, been doing great stuff the last couple of years. You're going to be looking at a purchase price somewhere between 100 and 300. Now, that's not chicken feed, but you also can't live 20 years on that kind of money. Hopefully you have managed your finances in such a way, you have a 401k, you have a SEP IRA or something where you have enough money to live on. Don't rely on the business proceeds. If you have to rely on the business, pay all your debts and survive, that's the wrong time to sell the business. How will your family, especially your kids, feel about selling out? How is your eldest son, who's he's in college and whatnot, and he always was hoping that you give the business to him. All of a sudden, you announce that you're going to be selling out after a while. How's he or she going to feel about that? Also, too, how are your employees going to feel about that? Employees become family after a while, and maybe there's one of them who thinks that he or she is going to be the successor to your business when you leave. How are they going to feel when you come in and announce one day that you're selling your business to Cliff Ennico, some weirdo lawyer that nobody knows? How are they going to feel? Another consideration: if you own the real estate where the business operates, are you going to sell the real estate along with the business? Especially here in the wealthy suburbs of New York City, Westchester County, New York, Fairfield County, Connecticut, you may find, and by talking to some local brokers, you may find out that the real estate is worth more than the business is. And if that's the case, maybe you ought to hold on to that real estate. Maybe, you sell the business and you give the seller a long-term lease. You don't sell the building and the land on which it's located. You try to find other tenants for the building and you become a landlord. That's a very nice way to give yourself a recurring passive income in your retirement years. How much debt does the business have? If you are selling assets, which is how most businesses are sold, we'll talk about that in a minute, you're going to have to pay the purchase. You're going to have to pay them all out of the closing proceeds. So, if you are selling a business for 200 and you have $250,000 in debt, you got to worry about that extra $50,000. Where's that money going to come from? Because the buyer is not going to want to take over a business that has that kind of debt on it. At what stage of the business life cycle is your business? Do you have a young, spry teenager that's just beginning to come out of the chute and live their life, or do you have a little old man who's getting ready for the nursing home? You have to be very, how can I say, very cynical about this. A lot of business models right now that have been around for many, many years are becoming obsolete due to COVID. I really wonder whether standalone restaurants are going to be around in 5 to 10 years. They're all going to be takeout places. They're all going to be ghost kitchens, I think, in 5 years. I really question what the upscale dining experience is going to be like in 5 to 10 years. And so should you if you're running a restaurant. A lot of things are going to be going online. If you have a little, retail boutique, you're going to be an Amazon store in the next 5 years. Does it have the potential for growth, or is it a declining business? That's going to affect the pricing. It may affect whether you do the deal or not. Will key relationships go along with the deal? Is your business heavily dependent on location? If you got a killer location and everybody's coming to you because you got the best location in town, your landlord becomes a very important player in the deal. And that landlord has to be willing to go along with your sale, or else you got a real problem. If you've only got a year or so left to go on your lease, the landlord is going to be the one who dictates the purchase price, not you. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Last but not least, I said this in my other presentation. This presentation is kind of a bookend to a program I did last month on buying a business. You need, in order to sell a business or to buy a business, you need a good lawyer and a good accountant. You need them both because we look at different things. Make sure you got the right lawyer and the right accountant. If your personal lawyer is someone who only does real estate closings, that's not the type of attorney who's going to help you sell a business. You need someone who does what they call M&A work, merger and acquisition work. It doesn't have to be for big companies. You need somebody like me, okay, or somebody who looks like me, hopefully a little bit better looking. Okay, so how do you find buyers? Okay, I always tell my clients who are looking to sell, start looking closer to home. Talk to your family, talk to key employees. Let them know, I'm kind of getting on in years and maybe selling the next 3 to 5 years. Really, it's 1 or 2, but you don't tell them that. And I might be thinking about, you've sort of been coming up the ranks. You know this business as well as I do. Could you possibly, would you be interested? Your best buyers are the ones who can take over and run the business without any interruption in the quality of service. Look at favored customers or key suppliers. I remember the TV show Cheers from the 1980s. We all remember Cliff, the barfly that always used to come there. That was his home away from home. Well, it turns out Cliff had a little bit of money. So when the Tony Danza character, the Ted, what's his name? I can't remember the actor, decides to sell off the business, Cliff would be a logical person to do it because he wants to maintain, that experience. He wants to, still have a home to go to after a hard day's work. Think about stuff like that. Key suppliers as well. If you account for more than 10 or 15% of the sales of another company, they want to maintain that distribution channel, and they may be a potential one. If you are a franchise, always talk to your neighboring franchisees. If you're in a territory that's locked in there, you're hemmed in by franchisees all around you, talk to those people, get a little auction going that your territory may be coming up and give them room to expand. Once a franchise saturates a certain area, the only way that it can grow is by franchisees buying out each other. You may not have to look any further, quite frankly, if you have a franchise business. There are published sources that you can advertise in. I'm not a big fan of these because it makes you look desperate. Any business that's publishing, an ad in the New York Times is probably one that's having trouble getting sold. There's probably a reason for that. That's my prejudice as an attorney. It may be wrong in a lot of cases, but that's how people look at you. Here are some of the places online where you can advertise. Business brokers. I'm of mixed mind about business brokers. I'll be honest with you. I've worked with some very good ones. I've worked with some very bad ones. Their fees are high. You have to be aware of that. Very often you'll pay a 10 to 15% of the sales price, and a lot of them, quite frankly, don't earn it. They beat the bushes, they find you a buyer, and then they just disappear until the closing when they show up with their handout asking for their commission check. I can't tell you how many closings I've attended where somebody at one point says, "Hey, who's that guy sitting over in the corner? Who's he representing?" Well, that's the broker. He's just waiting for his check. Really? There was a broker involved? I mean, no one heard from this person. I can't tell you how many closings I've been to that are like that. If you have a web-based business, there are some actually pretty good brokers out there. There's a company called FE International. They're based in Boston. Website Closers is based in Florida. They specialize in like e-commerce businesses. If you have an Amazon store that you're looking to sell, this is the place that you're probably going to go looking for to sell your business. Also, too, if you have a franchise business, there are some excellent networks of franchise brokers. There's frannet.com, there's franchoice.com. Those are the two big ones. Then there's some smaller ones. If you get a copy of Entrepreneur Magazine, which I always feel Entrepreneur Magazine is very misnamed. I really wish that they could call it Franchise Monthly, because that's what it's all about. You go in there, all the ads are from franchises. Virtually all the ads in Entrepreneur Magazine are from franchises. Take a look at some of those. If there are other local brokers out there, they probably advertise in Entrepreneur Magazine because that's where they all advertise. Don't be afraid to ask around. Talk to your SCORE counselor. They may know of other people that are looking to buy businesses. The SCORE people all talk to each other. At least I hope they do. And I hope that you're giving out my name too. Trade industry associations, your chamber of commerce, maybe accountants and lawyers. I'm of two minds about that. I mean, every once in a while, I'll get an email from someone who's looking to buy a business, but unless I really know the person, I'm really reluctant to give their name to one of my clients, because if the client calls and they have a bad experience, now it's my judgment that's on the line here. Hey, Cliff, you thought this guy, you referred me to this guy. You thought he was great. The guy's an idiot. What, are you an idiot too? You thought he was good. I thought you knew what you were doing. That's what happens. And a lot of lawyers and accountants are reluctant to refer for that reason. Okay, so now, but be careful about going public. If you're in a very competitive business, you have to be very careful before you let the world know that you're looking for a buyer. If you're, because if you let the word out too quickly, competitors may smell blood on the water and start hitting up your customers and offering them all kinds of wonderful deals. Next thing you know, you don't have any business anymore. Always, 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 whenever you're dealing with a broker or a prospective buyer, get them to sign a non-disclosure agreement before you start giving them the real stuff, and make sure that the non-disclosure agreement specifically says you will not disclose the fact that the business is for sale to any third parties without my consent. Okay, make sure it says that. Don't pick the form off the internet. I know they all look alike sometimes, but this is something I have to tell you, I have never, ever taken a non-disclosure agreement off the web and filled in the client's name and handed it to them as a finished product. Even non-disclosure agreements, which are pretty much boilerplate, have to be custom tailored to specific situations. And a non-disclosure that you would use for like selling an invention is not the same that you would use for selling a business. Always get a good non-disclosure agreement from anybody that you disclose your information to. And do your due diligence, especially if you're financing the deal, if you're taking back paper. If you're gonna agree to let the buyer pay you out over time, do your due diligence on the buyer. Do they understand the business? If you're selling a web-based business, do they understand internet marketing and SEO, search engine optimization? If they ask you what SEO means, that is not a good buyer for a web-based business. Do they have decent credit? Do they have a blemish-free background? I have had sellers, especially sellers who are taking back paper on a deal, actually hire private investigators to look into the buyers. Do they have a criminal background? Are they looking for a place to launder money? And this is why they're doing this. Sometimes you get some nasty surprises when you look into somebody's background. Ask anyone who's ever been on a dating site. You know the idea. Do they understand your customers and community? Those of you who listen to my other program on buying a business, and by the way, if you're listening on YouTube, if you search for Cliff Ennico buying a business on YouTube, you'll get to that video. I always tell people, never buy a business that is more than 10 to 15 miles away from where you live unless you're planning to move there. Are these people part of the community? Do they get where you live? Are they part of the community? Especially if you're taking back paper. You don't want to sell this business and have them run it into the ground within 6 months. Do your due diligence, and don't just sell because you like the person. Okay, so you found a buyer. Congratulations. Now you have to set the purchase price. In most deals, the parties do what's called a non-binding letter of intent, LOI. This is sometimes called a memorandum of understanding, or MOU. I call it an LOI. It's a non-binding term sheet that basically spells out the key economic aspects of the deal, what the purchase price is going to be, when it's going to be paid, when the closing is going to take place. It's a non-binding document, but it basically helps whoever's drafting the legal documents to get everything right on the first time. The more you put into the LOI, the lower your legal fee is going to be. If someone calls and says, I'm selling a business, I need you to draft the purchase agreement. Okay, that's normally when an attorney gets involved in one of these deals. I'm going to say, well, okay, what's the business deal? Well, we haven't really decided on the purchase price yet. I try to talk them into doing an LOI first, because that just makes the attorney's lives a lot easier. When it comes to doing the documents, I can just use that as a template, fill in the blanks, and it will lower the overall cost of doing the deal. If I have to negotiate the business deal and the legal documents at the same time, that's when we go through multiple drafts of documents, and that's when the legal fees can get out of control. Most attorneys, just so you know, will not do these for a flat fee. They have to go by the hour, because anything involving negotiation, they're not in control of their time. They don't really know going in how long it's going to take to get this thing done. If the other side's attorney turns out to be an idiot, you may end up going through several drafts of documents before things get signed. So be mindful of that. We'll talk more about attorneys in a minute and the role that they play in these deals. What is the purchase price? Well, for most retail service type of business, which is what we're talking about here, it's usually a multiple of either of average sales or pre-tax earnings. Or sometimes it's a combination of both, but very rarely. If a business has pre-tax earnings, what they call EBIT, earnings before income taxes, that's what you use. For a business that doesn't have a very strong EBIT, but very strong sales, you sometimes base the purchase price upon a multiple of average sales. And you always do an average. You usually look back 3 to 5 years and you do an average of the sales or the EBIT over those years. Why do you do that? Because you want to average out good years and bad years. If you're selling a business now based upon your pre-tax earnings in 2020 and you're running a restaurant, chances are you are not going to get a good price for this business. Okay, 2020 was a lousy year for most restaurants. 2018 and 2019 were better years. So what you want to do is you want to average the three and to come up with the average sales or pre-tax earnings that you're going to base your purchase price on. Look for non-recurring items of income and expense. So let's say, for example, you had a windfall sometime in 2019. Something happened, you sold an asset or something, and you had a one-time unrecognized gain of $50,000. Always back that out when you do your calculation. You want to show the buyer what average years are all about. And if there were some significant spikes, because again, non-recurring items or non-recurring expenses that you occurred, try to back those out of the calculation when you do it. The one big reason to hire a business or a franchise broker when you're looking to sell a business is that they can give you an idea of comparable prices. Valuing a business is as much an art as a science. There's the science of, okay, what's the sales, what's the pre-tax earnings, but then there's the question of what's the right multiple for that. And that's where the art comes in. What most brokers do, they have access to databases that you don't have, where they can find out, okay, now the guy's selling a deli, the client's selling a deli, let's see, how much did other delis sell for in the Westport, Fairfield, Greater Bridgeport area over the last 3 years? They actually have access to that information. And they can actually come up with you've seen those statistical charts where they do the mean and the median. This is why you took statistics in college. If you're a business broker, you try to figure out what the mean and the median prices are, and this is how you set the price when you go out in the market looking for a buyer. That's the main reason to hire a broker, is that they help you with the valuation process. They have access to things that you don't have. One number that you really want to focus on when you're looking to set the purchase price is, what is the owner's discretionary income, or ODI? That's basically how much have you taken out of the business over the last, 2 to 3 years. Again, you're looking at averages. Most buyers, and if you looked at the program that I did last month on how to buy a business, I tell buyers, look at the owner's ODI and ask yourself, will you be able to cover the purchase price out of the ODI in 1 to 3 years? They're going to be looking to do that. So you should do the calculation as well. If you're looking at a business that has only generated $60,000 in income for you over the last 3 years, do not think it's going to sell for $300,000. 150 to 200 is probably what the buyers are going to offer, because they're looking at that ODI figure and they want to amortize the purchase price over 1 to 3 years, maybe a little longer depending on the business. How do you pick the multiple? It's a crapshoot. It really is. Again, if you're using a broker, they'll look at databases, they'll figure out what average prices have been in your area, and you can pick it that way. But if you're not going to use a broker, if you're doing it yourself, I always tell people that the average multiple is between 2 and 4. Almost always. Sometimes it's a little lower for a service business. It's 1 to 2 times, the average pre-tax earnings or average sales over the last 2 to 3 to 5 years. If the sales or profits are growing and the business is well poised to survive a tech-driven future, go to the high end, go to like 3 or 4 on the multiple. If the sales and profits are steady or declining, or the business is facing challenges, go low, 1 to 2 times, average EBIT or revenue, maybe 1.5. Remember always, it's a business, not a baby. Whatever price you offer, the buyer is going to counter offer, and the counter offer is going to be significantly lower than what you think the business is worth. Be prepared to be disappointed. That's what I tell every one of my sellers. That's the first thing I tell my seller clients. Be prepared for some disappointment. The buyer is not going to see this business as you do. You think it's wonderful because it provided you for a living for the last umpty years, but they're just looking at all the issues, all the problems that they're going to face, the potential loss of revenue if clients go elsewhere. That's what they're going to be focused on. So don't be surprised. There's going to be negotiation. Okay, should you help finance the deal? Okay, seller financing. Should you take a note? Okay, sometimes you do this. The buyer pays 60 to 80% of the purchase price at the closing, and the remaining 10-20% is done in the form of a promissory note. Generally, the payout period is 2 to 3 years. Right now, commercial interest rates are about 5% or 6% per annum. They're not great. Interest rates are pretty low right now. Seller beware. One of the first questions you want to ask a buyer, are they using an SBA loan to finance the purchase price? That is one of the first questions you got to ask a buyer, because the SBA has some very complicated rules. Your score person can tell you about this. And the rules have just changed in a very big way. If the buyer is using an SBA loan and you're taking back paper, the SBA is going to want you to subordinate your loan for 3, 5, or even 10 years. This means you do not get a penny of that money that's under the note until the SBA lender is paid in full 100%. That may take years. Okay, there are ways that you can get around that, which are kind of a little advanced for this program. So I'm probably not going to spend a lot of time doing this. But be very careful. If the buyer is doing an SBA loan, you're going to be asked to sit on a portion of the purchase price for a very long period of time. Make sure your attorney knows some ways to get around that so that you can get the money out in some other way. Okay, do a credit check always on your buyer if you're taking back money. What you don't want is a situation where 6 months later the guy calls you up and says, hey, I got to close the doors. This business it was a piece of crap. It went into the ground, when in fact they just didn't know what they were doing. It's one of the worst things that can happen. Whenever you take back paper, always take a lien. It's called a UCC lien, like a mortgage on the business assets, and always a personal guarantee from the business's owners. Whenever somebody buys your business, they always form an LLC or a corporation. Don't rely on the LLC's or the corporation's credit. Get a personal guarantee from the owners, the individual buyer. That way, if things go bad, you can always go after their house. Quite frankly, it gives you that right. Without a personal guarantee, your recovery is limited to the business assets, and they may be worthless by the point. If the buyer runs the business into the ground, those assets may have no value. There's another way that a buyer can pay. It's called royalty financing. Sometimes you hear this referred to as a bootstrap or an earn-in. Basically, what the buyer does here, instead of paying a note with interest, they pay a percentage of the business's gross revenue, net revenue, or EBIT, again, earning before income taxes, pre-tax earnings, for a specific period in lieu of fixed interest, or it could be an additional to fixed interest. Sometimes you do a note with an equity kicker, they call it, where in addition to getting your interest, you also get a percentage like 5% of gross sales every quarter or something like that for a period of time. This could be a way of selling to a buyer that doesn't have a lot of money. If a buyer doesn't have a lot of money to buy your business up front, but you're desperate to sell, this is one way that you can structure the deal, where you get a small amount of money at the closing, but the buyer pays you a percentage of sales. The good news is, if the buyer knows what they're doing and he gets the sales to go up, you participate in that. You get a share of that every quarter, every month, every year. I prefer quarterly payouts on royalties. That's my default. But the downside is that if he runs the business into the ground, you suffer along with the buyer. So my suggestion is, if you're doing a royalty deal, make sure you have the right to get financial statements every quarter. Make sure you have the right to audit the buyer at least once a year. As Mark Twain said in Pudd'nhead Wilson, put all of your eggs in one basket, but watch that basket. Don't just sell the business and leave the buyer to his or her own devices. Stay on top of things. And the minute you see things heading south, jump on it. because that's your revenue. That's your retirement income that they're running down there. Okay, should you sell assets or stock? The bottom line here, 95% of business sales are sales of assets. The buyer forms a new LLC or corporation, and that corporation or LLC buys the assets of your business. They don't buy the stock in your corporation or your LLC. Selling assets is, and why do they do it? Because selling assets is good for the buyer. The buyer assumes only those liabilities that they wish to assume. If they decide that they don't want to assume a liability, then you're stuck with it. So let's say you have an equipment lease for a copier and they decide they don't need a copier. They got copiers of their own that they want to use. Equipment leases have to be paid in full. You can't just hand the keys to the copier back and have them take it. You got to pay off the balance due on that. So you're going to be stuck with that debt. Whatever debts the buyer doesn't buy, you're stuck with them. If your business is a C Corp, the proceeds of sale are going to get taxed twice. You're going to have to pay, once the closing takes place, you have to pay a corporate income tax on the purchase price. And then when you take the money out, you have to pay tax again at your personal tax rate. If your business is an LLC or an S Corp, there's no double taxation, but there will be depreciation recapture on equipment, anything that depreciates that you sell in the business. And if you have an asset-rich business like a trucking company or a landscaping business where a lot of the assets are in the form of equipment that depreciate over time, that can really eat into the sales proceeds in a big way. You need a really good accountant when you're selling a business like that to make sure you understand what the impact of that is going to be tax-wise. Also, too, when you sell the assets, your corporation or LLC stays in place. And you may want to keep it around for a while. Maybe you have another, unrelated business. Maybe your spouse has a business that they want to do and you want to use the corporation. You want to save some money and just use the old corporation, change the name, whatever. That's fine. But if you do decide to wind up the corporation, there's going to be costs involved in keeping it on life support. You're going to have to file final tax returns. You're going to have to do a lot of stuff there that may cost you some money. Now, selling stock is much better for sellers. The buyer assumes everything, including the stock in the corporation. You hand them the minute book at the closing. The buyer takes over. You're gone. Once the closing takes place, you're done. You're out completely. You are off the hook once the deal closes. Your income is the difference between the purchase price and your basis in the shares, basically what you paid for them when you first started the business, probably nothing, and is usually taxed at favorable long-term capital rates. But, and there's a big but here, in stock sales, very often the seller enters into a consulting agreement where he or she agrees to work with the buyer over a long period of time or whatever. Keep in mind that if you take back that kind of agreement, any income that you get under that is ordinary income, not capital gains. I don't want to make a big deal about this. The golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules. Buyers have the money and they will almost always insist that you sell assets rather than stock. The only exception, if you have a business that has a licensed government permit or key contract that cannot be assigned to the buyer without a penalty or without having to be renegotiated, then you can probably persuade the buyer to accept a stock sale. So for example, if you have a liquor store, liquor licenses in New York and Connecticut are not transferable. You have to get a whole new one. So the only way to keep the liquor permit in place for the same location is to sell the stock of the business, not the assets. That's also true, by the way, of businesses that have Amazon and eBay accounts. We'll talk about that in another couple of slides. Okay, who should draft the documents? Here's Cliff Ennico's rule. In a business sale, the parties whose attorney is drafting the documents usually has the higher legal bill at closing. Okay, so the temptation sometimes is to let the buyer's attorney do all the work. Let them draft all the documents. Your attorney just has to spend a couple of hours reviewing it and you get off cheap. That is a very bad decision for two reasons. Number one, if the buyer's attorney is not familiar with business sales, what he or she's going to do is going to pick a form off the internet and make a few changes. Your attorney is the one who's going to have to clean up the mess, and that could actually lead to a bigger legal bill than having the attorney draft the documents himself or herself. Secondly, even with a good attorney on the other side, the documents are going to be drafted in the buyer's favor, and you will have to fight an uphill battle to get concessions. I always feel it's better to have your attorney draft all the documents. That way, the deal is going to be drafted in your favor, and hopefully your attorney is competent enough that you'll only have maybe one or two drafts of the documents before you close. Okay. Negotiating the purchase and sale agreement. I'm just going to breeze through this a little bit. I'm going to, this is for those of you watching on YouTube, spend some time on this slide. When selling assets, what are the assets you're going to keep for yourself? What are the liabilities is the buyer not going to assume? Most asset purchase agreements say the seller is selling all the assets except as set forth on Exhibit A. What's going to be on that Exhibit A? If you have a Picasso print in your lobby that has been in your family for generations, make sure that that is included when you sell the business. I actually have a very funny story. It's in some of my other videos. Years ago, one of my clients was selling a dental practice, a pediatric dental practice, and there was a huge 200-gallon fish tank in the lobby of the dental office. And all the kids, of course, loved watching the fish and doing all that stuff. Well, on the day of closing, it turns out there was a dispute about whether the fish tank was going to go with the seller or whether it was going to stay with the business. Well, the tank was going to stay with the business, but the seller had gotten personally attached to some of the fish in the tank. So the other attorney and I spent literally an hour of our lives picking these tropical fish out of the tank physically, putting them in plastic baggies so the seller could take them with him from the closing and leave the rest of the fish in the tank. That's probably my funniest closing story. But people get very emotionally attached to items of property. Make sure you identify those before you do the agreement. Normally, cash on hand, bank deposits, accounts receivable are normally not included in a sale of assets. If you're selling your business assets, you have to deal with whatever the accounts receivable are at closing and make sure that those get collected. That's not the buyer's responsibility. He doesn't have to assume those unless he or she wants to. There's usually an upfront deposit upon signing. Usually it's 5 to 10% of the purchase price. When does it go to the seller? When does it go to the buyer? I want crystal clarity in all of my purchase and sale agreements on that issue. I don't, especially if I'm holding that money in escrow in my trust account, I don't want to get to a closing and realize that there's a last minute issue about who's going to be getting that money. I could be sitting on that escrow for years until it gets resolved. So I want crystal clarity. Basically, it should always go to you unless a third party has failed to consent to the sale. So if your landlord just turned into an SOB and just rejected the buyer, well, in that case, the buyer should get his or her money back. In all of the situations, it should go to you. Be sure your attorney holds it in their trust account. There are a million rules governing lawyers' trust accounts. And believe me, if your attorney doesn't want to go to jail, he will not play around with that money. Make sure that money is in a trust account where it's safe. Most of the time when you sign a contract of sale, the buyer has a due diligence period. Make it as short as possible. And also, too, if he's going to be getting financing for the deal, make sure that the time between the day you sign the agreement and the day he presents a commitment letter from a bank saying he's got the money, make sure that period, we call it a financing contingency, is as short as possible. Very often, the purchase price has to be adjusted at closing. If you're closing in the middle of the month, for example, you're going to have to prorate the rent that you're paying to your landlord for that month. You get some of it, the buyer gets some of it. Watch out for security deposits. Very often when you sell a business and you assign the lease to the buyer, you forget about the deposit that you paid 20 years ago when you first leased the building. That belongs to you. And either the landlord has to pay it back to you or the buyer has to reimburse you for the cost of the security. That's a very commonly overlooked things at closings. Representations and warranties. These are the statements that you make about the business. As of the closing date, we don't have any litigation. No one's threatening to sue us. The assets are free of liens. There's about 20 different representations and warranties that the seller is asked to give at a closing. Read every one of them carefully and ask yourself, can I still sleep at nights? Can I say this to the buyer and still sleep at nights? If the answer is no, make sure you have a very focused conversation with your attorney and put a schedule up there saying, well, we don't have any threatened litigation, but this person fell in the store a week ago. They may sue, they may not, but we're going to disclose this to you because it could potentially be a lawsuit. I mean, if it does, it happened before the closing, so I'll indemnify you for it, but I want to make sure you're aware of that. I don't want you to be surprised. Buyers hate it when they close a deal, they buy a business, and there's surprises after the closing. Your goal as seller is to give them a surprise fee experience to the best of your knowledge. It's much harder to prove, it's much easier to prove that something happened than to prove that the seller knew it was going to happen. Always condition your warranties by saying that they're to the best of your knowledge. Okay, here's some more stuff on the purchase and sale agreement. The seller's non-compete clause, you will have to sign, as we said earlier, you are going to have to sign a non-compete at the closing. The time limit and the geographic restriction must be reasonable. If you're selling a deli and the buyer wants a non-compete saying you will not operate a deli anywhere in the United States, that's a bit overreaching. A court is probably not going to enforce that. If you go down to Florida, you get bored, you want to open up a local deli, your sellers and your buyers in Connecticut, you're not going to lose. He's not going to lose any business because of that. Now, of course, if you're a web-based business, now that's different. If you're selling online and you have an Amazon store, don't be surprised if the buyer asks for a non-compete that says you will not sell, merchandise, the same merchandise online anywhere in the world, and that probably will be an enforceable non-compete. The internet has changed a lot of our traditional thinking about non-competes and what's enforceable and what isn't. Beware of non-disparagement clauses. I'm seeing these more and more in my deals. Buyers are putting these clauses in saying you will not badmouth the seller, you will not badmouth the buyer, you will not badmouth the business, especially if you're financing the deal or you're taking royalty payments over a series of time. This could be a really big gotcha. You sell the business, you're not really happy with the way the buyer is doing, so you go on your social media and you say something stupid on Facebook. That disparagement, by disparaging the business in a public forum like that, you may have just given your buyer an excuse to get out of the deal and avoid all those payments that he owes you. So be very careful about non-disparagement clauses. Try to knock them out wherever possible. It's so easy to say something stupid on social media these days. I never used to be bothered by these. A non-disparagement clause is a gag order. It basically says you cannot say anything bad about the buyer for a period of time. If you do sign one of these, make damn sure that you and nobody in your family makes the mistake of going online and saying something bad about the business. Oh, this guy, Cliff, he really is running the business into the ground. It's no longer what it used to be. You shouldn't go to him. Be very careful about stuff like that. It could come back and haunt you. Okay, indemnification. If anything happens, remember that person that slipped and fell in the store 2 days before closing? You're going to have to indemnify your buyer for that. That's why you have to keep your insurance in place for a while after you sell a business, just to make sure there's enough insurance money to cover that. I always try, when I'm representing a seller, to put a cap and a deductible, a floor and a ceiling on the seller's indemnity obligations. So if the amount of the indemnity is less than, say, $1,000, the seller doesn't have to worry about it. But the seller's total obligations are not to exceed, $25,000, $30,000, an amount that could reasonably be covered by insurance. Again, you're the attorneys. Well, these are the things the attorneys fight about when they do the purchase and sale agreement. Watch out for the survival clause. The survival clause, it's usually at the end of the agreement. That is like a private statute of limitations. It says the representations and warranties under the agreement will survive for a period of X months. It's usually 6 months to a year. Make it as short as possible. That means that if something happens, but nobody sues during the statute of limitations period, you're off the hook. The shorter the statute of limitations, the better. Okay. Okay, so you sign the agreement. Now the purchaser goes into due diligence where they can kick the tires. The thing you have to remember is that during the due diligence period, which should always be as short as possible, the buyer can walk for any reason whatsoever. If the buyer's astrologer tells them not to do the deal because Mercury is not in a line with Saturn, he can walk from the deal and he gets his deposit back. Anything that he or she discovers during the due diligence period will cause them to walk. So do some preparation, prepare for due diligence before you sell the business. Are there any red flags in your tax returns for the last 3 to 5 years? Read the footnotes in the financial. If you have accountants prepare your financial statements, if you have audited or reviewed financial statements, look at the footnotes, because that's where the accountants say, well, yes, but there's an exception here. Look at that stuff and make sure there's nothing in there that a buyer would be upset at. Do what they call a UCC search, or have your attorney do it. It takes 10 minutes now. You can do it online. If you have any liens, big problem when you sell a business. You borrowed money years ago from a bank. You paid it off. But when you paid it off, the bank forgot to remove the lien of record. So now it shows up on the buyer's search. When the buyer does a UCC search, it says, hey, you still have a lien in favor of XYZ Bank. Oh, I paid it off years ago. Okay, call the bank and get that lien removed. And you know what? The bank is no longer in existence. The bank has merged with another bank. And you got to figure out who is that bank now, and get a hold of somebody in their lien department who's willing to go back and look at microfilm records 10 years ago to make sure that the loan has been paid off. That it can be a mess. That can hold you up for months. That can hold your closing up for months. If you ever borrowed money from a bank and you paid it off, check to see that the liens have been removed. And if not, jump on that, because no buyer will buy the business with a lien outstanding, even a lien that's bogus. You may be able to indemnify for that, but most buyers won't accept that. If I'm representing a buyer, I'm going to push back on that, saying, no, I want proof. I want that lien removed of record. Outstanding lawsuits, threatened litigation. Your employees, are any of them did you make any promises to them that you cannot keep? Did you tell, Susan, your manager, that she's good, she'll have a job for at least the next 3 years because she has a kid in college, and you'll guarantee that you'll keep her employed for that period? Watch out for statements like that, because your buyer is going to be bound by that. All of your employees should be at will. You should be able to terminate them for any reason or no reason at all. One of the most important things I'm going to talk about in this talk is getting third parties on board. If you remember nothing else from this talk, I want you to remember this. In my experience, and I've been doing these deals now for 40 years of my life, usually, as long as the seller and the buyer communicate well, there usually aren't a whole lot of issues in these deals that the buyer and the seller cannot resolve. Whenever there's a problem in the deal, it always comes from a third party who has to approve the deal and doesn't want to approve the deal for some reason. Landlords especially are the biggest cause of deal failure in small business sales. And if you think about it, that shouldn't surprise you. The seller wants to sell, the buyer wants to buy. They're both motivated. They're communicating. Whatever issues come up, they're resolving them. But the landlord isn't happy about all this. For 20 years, he or she has had, a steady income stream from a very reliable tenant. Now they're being asked to accept a total unknown, somebody that they don't even know, who's going to be their tenant and pay their rent every month. A lot of landlords get very nervous about that, and a lot of them get freaky when you announce to them that you're selling the business. Whenever you're looking to sell a business and you lease your real estate from a landlord, always make sure the landlord is on board early on. Get the landlord. That is part of your job as a seller. This is what a seller does, is make sure that the third parties that have to agree to the deal are on board. That's on you. It's not the buyer's responsibility to make sure that they're on board. It is yours. So your landlord. Equipment leases, I said before, equipment leases are always due on sale. They're going to have to be paid in full. Lenders, if you're paying off a bank loan at the closing, you got to get a payoff statement from the bank saying exactly to the penny, including interest, how much you have to pay on X date to pay off that loan. Franchisors have to approve the buyer. The buyer has to sign a whole new franchise agreement. There's a whole litany of stuff that a franchise is going to want your buyer to sign. Make sure you get that going early on. Key employees, when do you tell them that you're selling? I don't like my clients making the announcement to their clients, to their employees, until at least 2 or 3 days before the closing. I don't want them, because then what happens, people start thinking about leaving. They start brushing up their resumes. So when the buyer buys the business, half the employees quit the day after, the next day. That's a real horrible thing. And believe me, buyers are going to want you to protect them against that happening. But you don't want to announce too early either, because then they jump ship and they go to competitors. So there's a very delicate dance you have to do and work it out with the buyer in advance as to when you will make the announcement to the employees. Okay, taxes are very straightforward. If you're selling the assets of a business, you have to allocate the purchase price to different asset categories because they depreciate at different levels. The buyer probably has more of an issue here than you do. The two things you want to do in the allocation, you want to allocate as much as possible to equipment and depreciable property so that you can take an immediate deduction under IRC section 179 of the Internal Revenue Code. Right now, you can deduct over $1 million in equipment when you sell a business. They keep raising this threshold every year. So try to allocate as much of the purchase price to equipment so you can take an immediate deduction. Avoid any allocation to the non-compete clause. If you allocate anything to the non-compete clause, it's ordinary income to you in the year the deal closes. You should not allocate more than 1% of the total purchase price in a deal to the non-compete covenant. Okay. Income, sales, payroll taxes. Just remember that if you're closing in the middle of a tax period, you are going to be required to adjust for the taxes at the closing. Okay. After the deal is done, okay, you're almost done. Transitions, but so the deal's closed. Congratulations, you got paid. The buyer got his financing. Everything went smoothly. Very rarely happens. There's always loose ends in these things. You are then going to be required to stick around for a while. Usually, in most deals, you're required to provide support to the buyer for 30 to 90 days without compensation. If the buyer wants more than that, then you should insist on compensation. You should do either an employment agreement or a consulting agreement where you get paid by the hour for anything that you do after 90 days. I will insist on that if I am your attorney. If you have financed the transaction, remember what Mark Twain said: put all your eggs in the basket, but watch that basket. Insist on annual tax returns, balance sheets, quarterly P&L. If there's a default, you should be able to foreclose on the business assets, just like you would a mortgage, and be freed from your non-compete obligation. Make sure the non-compete goes away if the buyer defaults on their note. Should you dissolve your corporation or LLC, I always insist that my seller clients keep it around for at least 1 year just to deal with any surprises that may come up, file final tax returns. There's always some loose ends that need to be cleaned up after a closing, and you want to make sure your corporation or LLC will still be there to protect you. We talked about selling a web-based business. The most important thing here is if your business has an Amazon or eBay account, try to do the deal as a stock sale, because if you do it as an asset sale and eBay or Amazon find out that the account is now under new management, what they do is they don't block the sale. They allow you to sell the account, but they take all the feedback and they reset it at zero. So all that 10,000 positive feedback that you earned on eBay over the last 5 years disappears, and the buyer has to start out from ground zero as if they were a newbie seller. And you know yourself, if you bought anything on eBay, you never buy from someone who has at least 100 feedback score. So be very careful. That's a real trap for the unwary when you sell an Amazon or eBay business. Okay, so here's my summary. Plan your future before you sell your business. Okay. Don't just sell your business, then figure out, okay, now what am I going to do next? Plan your future. Make sure you have enough to live on so you don't have to rely on the proceeds of sale to have a nice retirement. Be realistic when negotiating the purchase price. It's a business, not a baby. Line up a good accountant and a good lawyer before you sell the business. It's better to sell a business as stock rather than assets, but get used to the fact that 90% of the time you're going to be selling the assets of the business, and you're going to have to deal with the tax issues that arise from that. Your attorney should draft the transaction documents unless the buyer insists otherwise. Make sure all third parties, especially your landlord, are on board with the sale. If a problem comes up with a third party, those are tough things to deal with, and it may delay your closing by months. Understand thoroughly your non-compete indemnity and other post-closing obligations to the business, and be prepared to assist the buyer with transition services, especially if you are taking back paper. Put all your eggs in one basket, but watch that basket, as Mark Twain said. And that's all I have to say. We have a few minutes left for questions and answers. Bob, why don't we take a few of those now?
Yep, we do have a few questions. So I'll start with the first one that's in. Cliff, I think you partially may have made a reference to this, but maybe you can clarify what value can be placed on goodwill in setting the sale price.
Okay, well, the goodwill is kind of a delta. It's whatever you don't allocate to all the other stuff is allocated to goodwill. Now, if in a business that doesn't have a lot of hard assets, if it's just a bunch of contracts with customers, you may not be able to avoid allocating everything to the contracts and the goodwill, which the buyer depreciates over 15 years. You don't really get a big deduction out of that, but it may be the only way that you can do it. There are a lot of business now that don't have a lot of hard assets. If the business does have a lot of hard assets, try to allocate as much as possible to the goodwill. The one exception here is franchised businesses. Franchise businesses, if you are selling a franchise business, the franchise will always dictate that you allocate zero to goodwill because they view that as their property. If you're selling a Burger King owns the goodwill, not you. So that's one thing to be aware of when you're selling a franchise business. You won't be able to allocate a whole lot to goodwill because the franchise will not let you do it.
Okay. We have another one here. If the reason a seller is selling is bad reasons, then what should he do? Because it goes back to your initial slide where you talked about good reasons and bad reasons.
Well, let's put it this way. Sometimes you have no choice. Okay. You got to sell the business. Just be prepared, for an uphill negotiation, because the buyer is gonna see that, and they're not going to pay a lot for a muffler that's not going to work for them very much. If they see that they're the ones who are going to have to turn this business around and make it more successful, they're going to try to lowball you on the price. That's why you should talk about possibly taking back a significant portion of the purchase price in the form of a note, or better yet, do a royalty deal, where if the buyer really feels that he can turn the business around, great, then take advantage of that and let him prove himself, let him or her prove themselves, that way. You're in a very difficult position at that point, and you've got to be expecting you're going to be getting a fire sale price. And that may be the only way that you get anything for the business as well. I mean, not all businesses can be sold for a decent fair market value. Sometimes you just got to take the hit and get on with your life, get whatever you can.
Okay. One last one. As an alternative to an outright sale, what are your views of turning over the business to a managing director who co-owns for a split of the proceeds?
Okay, well, then you're going into partnership. That's not a sale at all. What you're doing is you're bringing on a partner. Okay, and always remember that when you bring a partner who on board, the only way that you can get rid of them legally is to buy them out for whatever purchase price they are willing to accept. If you do bring on a partner, make sure you have your attorney do a drop dead, what we call a buy sell agreement, that says, what happens if the partners fall out, who gets to buy out whom, what the purchase price is going to be. It's like a prenup in a marriage. Plan for the divorce before you bring the new partner on. And if it's a situation where you expect the new partner to buy you out over time, try to get that as specifically as you can in the business, that the new partner will buy an additional 10% of your equity every year for the next 5 years until he or she owns 100% of the business. Don't leave it to chance. Because if the business suffers, you want you want that person on the hook to pay you your retirement income. You don't want to be stuck running this with a 50% interest in a business until you're in your 90s. You don't want to be in that situation. Try to get things as specific as possible.
Great. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. As a reminder, the session was recorded and the materials will be available within a couple of days on our website, fairfieldcounty.score.org. Our next live webinar will be tomorrow, Wednesday, March the 3rd at noon. And the topic is digital marketing in 2021 with Jeff Seaver and John Dupre presenting. And again, if you want to take advantage of free individual counseling, you can do so by going to our website and clicking on the request a mentor link, or using the yellow bit.ly link you see on the screen. And if I could also ask you to please fill out your evaluations, they're very helpful to us. So on behalf of SCORE, I'd like to thank everyone for attending our live webinar today. And a special thank you to Cliff Ennico for his presentation today. And stay well, everyone, and have a great day.